Hello, hello. Can anyone hear me out there? Just giving an audio check before we start. Okay, I'm going to proceed as if you guys can hear me. Hopefully, you can. All right, so welcome. This is number 15. Wow, we have a lot of these to go. Let's see, we're on 15, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, Marcus Aurelius, and Jesus. This is going to be interesting. If you guys are new to this live stream, we do these watch parties every Monday at 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT, and then we do a discussion approximately 1 hour later. We take about a 10-minute or so intermission, and then everyone jumps into a discussion in a Zoom call, and it's pretty much open for anyone. We encourage everyone to participate. It's a pretty welcoming group, and if you have questions, if you want clarity on what you just watched, then it's a good place to get it. As always, UV, my partner on Future Thinkers, is going to be taking notes. She takes really thorough notes and it really helps to clarify it because some of these subjects are can be quite complex at times. So you can follow along with that at futurethinkers.org/meaning crisis notes. That'll forward you to a Google Doc. And if you want to contribute as well, I think she's got it open, or maybe you can make suggestions, I think, if you go into suggest mode. If there's anything that is missed, feel free to add it that way, and then she'll approve it. As always, the discussion link will be given during the intermission. And if you guys, as soon as the stream's over, if you can jump in straight to the discussion, that would be awesome, just so I can kind of get a head count before we start. And I think we'll probably start at 5 to 10 minutes after the hour. All right, let's get into it. Excuse the baby.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So last time we finished up our look at what was going on in Buddhism, and then we moved back to the West, and we started to take a look at what was coming after the Axial Revolution, and we saw that Aristotle's disciple Alexander ushered in a period of turmoil and cultural anxiety, a period where many people were experiencing domicide in a very wide manner, a deep and profound sense of loss of home, not of having a house or a dwelling, but that connectedness, that rootedness to one's culture, one's place, one's history, one's language group, one's religion, one's community, etc. And we saw that what happens is a change in the cultivation of wisdom. Notice again the deep connection between the cultivation of wisdom and the attempt to deal with enhancement of meaning or the response to a meaning crisis. What happens is a change in the notion of wisdom, and that wisdom now takes on a therapeutic dimension in which the philosopher is the physician of the soul and has to learn to cure anxiety. And then we learned how the Epicureans responded to this, how they diagnosed the problem like a physician and prescribed a response. They diagnosed the anxiety of the period of the Hellenistic domicide as being caused by an anxiety about one's own mortality. And we took a look at that, and we took a look at how they responded to that. They advocated giving up, I would argue, the quixotic attempt to achieve immortality, and instead trying to come to an acceptance, a lived acceptance of one's mortality. And they did that by getting you to realize, by slowly getting you to realize getting clear about your nebulous anxiety, that it's not about non-existence, it's not about experiencing total loss, it's about experiencing partial loss, and then there's a remedy to experiencing partial loss, which is to, right, set yourself upon those things that are actually constitutive of meaningful happiness, and then realizing, deeply realizing, and structuring your lives so that you will have those up until the moment of your death, which is philosophically informed friendship, meaningful relationships in which we are afforded the cultivation of wisdom and self-transcendence. Now, while I think mortality salience is definitely a part of the Hellenistic crisis, I don't think the Epicureans have a comprehensive understanding. And to get a more comprehensive understanding and diagnosis, we turn to the Stoics. But in order to understand the Stoics, we have to understand the group that they developed out of. Those were the Cynics. And the Cynics were not as impressed by Socrates' argumentation as Plato was. They were much more impressed by Socrates' capacity for confrontation and provocatively inducing aporia in people. And they started to practice this. And in doing so, they started to force people to realize the distinction between moral codes and purity codes, and to thereby pay more careful attention to what they're actually setting their hearts upon, so that their hearts would not be broken by being set on man-made, impermanent cultural systems and values. Zeno, a Cynic, was deeply impressed by this, but he was also impressed by Plato's argumentation. He wanted to integrate the two together, and he also had the fundamental insight that although particular cultures and historical institutions are contingent, being social is not. We are inherently social in the depths of our humanity. So leaving the polis was not actually an option, according to Zeno. Instead, what we have to do is realize that our issue isn't what we're setting our hearts upon, but how we're setting our hearts. Pay much more attention to the process than the product. So you can see how the Stoics are even picking up on something that's implicit in the Epicureans. The Epicureans aren't trying to change the world and eradicate death by bringing about immortality. The Epicureans are trying to get you to reframe, have an insight, not just an intellectual insight, but an existential insight that changes the meaning of your mortality. And this was the core of the Stoic insight. Pay attention to how that existential meaning is being made. Pay attention to how that process of co-identification, the way we're assuming and assigning identities, is occurring, because that's where your self and your identity and your agency are being forged. The problem is most of us let that process go by mindlessly, automatically, and reactively, and so we mar this process. We make it susceptible to distortion. And that distortion is going to be a distortion that affects the very machinery of our self, of our being in the world. So what did the Stoics advocate that we need to do? Well, we need to bring this process of co-identification, of assuming various roles of our agency, assuming various identities, and assigning various identities in the arena. We need to bring this whole, right, co-determination, co-creation of agency and arena into our awareness. So they advocated prosos and prokairon. And you're going to see similarities here to what we saw in Buddhism, but also some differences. So prosos is to pay attention. Now, obviously, we're always paying attention, so that's useless advice. What they meant is pay attention to how you're paying attention. Pay attention to how you're judging. Pay attention to this process. Learn, right? Learn to see there's a difference between the meaning, and I mean here the modal meaning, the existential mode you're in. I don't mean semantic meaning. Learn to distinguish between the meaning and the event. Let's stop here. Let's stop here. This is the core, I would argue, of all of our current psychotherapies that are cognitive psychotherapies. Learning to distinguish between the event and the meaning you give the event. Because this is happening, this is like when I talked before about your glasses, they're normally transparent. Because we almost always unconsciously framing events, the meaning and the event are fused together. But here's the issue. They're not identical. Events are events. The meaning is the co-identification process that is taking place in response to the event. That could be a process of parasitic processing that's not intrinsic to the event at all. In fact, the meaning isn't part of the event at all. And this is important, because if you keep them fused, you will be confused. If the meaning and the event are fused, the only way you can alter the meaning is by altering the event. The problem with that is sometimes you can, but here's the thing. Here's the thing that the Stoics are doing, and this is very much like what the Buddha was doing with trying to make you realize how threatened you are. You do not have as much control as you think you do. Epictetus, one of the great Stoic philosophers, starts his manual for living, basically his instruction manual of how to try and live a Stoic life, with saying, the core of wisdom is knowing what's in your control and what's not in your control, and stop pretending that things are in your control that aren't. Because most of the time, we do not exercise as much control over events as we like to believe, and we delude ourselves that we do, precisely because if we lose control of the event, we will, of course, lose control of the meaning, because we have fused the meaning and the event together. We are confused, existentially confused. How can such a confusion occur to us? We've already talked about this. I mentioned Erich Fromm when we talked about the being and the having mode. I mentioned at that time, and we would come back to it, that Fromm was directly influenced by the Stoics. It's the Stoics who got us, right, to realize, right, to use Frommian language, the distinction between the having mode and the being mode. The having mode is met by controlling things. And there are some things we literally have to control. Water, food, air, shelter. But most of our most pertinent needs are not needs that are met by exercising control. They are needs that are met by enhancing meaning. We have to become. Look, the being mode is met by developing the agent-arena relationship, by becoming mature, which isn't just something that happens inside of me. Look, when I become mature, it isn't just that I'm changed inside, I also inhabit a different arena. And we recognize that socially. That's why we don't let little kids get married or drive cars or own guns. They're not allowed to move in a certain arena. Maturity is a agent-arena relationship. It is a particular existential meaning. But if you do not know how to separate the meaning from the events, you're liable to be very seriously modally confused, such that you pursue maturity by trying to have a car. You pursue being in love by having sex and controlling and manipulating. But it doesn't work because you really can't exercise as much control over the world as you need in order to stabilize the meaning. Do you see how this is like the Cynics still? Right? You're trying to control a world that largely is beyond your control. You're setting your hearts on things, and your heart's going to be broken. But it's not just about man-made things. Anything can fall prey to this. You have to practice bringing into your awareness in a way that is transformative and developmental the distinction between events and the meaning of events, and realizing this. You often act as if you have no control over the meaning because you're ignorant of the processes and it's transparent to you, and you focus on trying to control the event, in which you often have much less control than you realize. This is what you should do. Pull the two apart, the meaning and the event, and recalibrate your sense of control and identity, because you have actually way more control over this than you realize or practice, and you have way less control over this than you realize or practice. That's why the core of wisdom is knowing what's in our control versus what's not in our control. So, how do you practice that? And how does your identity change as you do? Well, the practice is prochiron. This means sort of ready to hand. It means remembering, but in the sense of sati, like mindfulness. It means remembering in a way that brings skills and sensitivities and sensibilities to bear in an appropriate and effective manner. It means remembering in a modally existential sense. So you practice a bunch of psychotechnologies to try and get them so internalized that you can not know that there's a distinction. I know that I should go outside the 9 dots, but I need to know how to actually separate these things. So, what do? Well, you engage in moment-to-moment practices. You can see this. A book where you can see somebody doing this. And the book has to be read properly because many people misread the book. This is the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. People read this book and they often think the point of the book is to believe the propositions he is proposing. The book is not written to you. It is not an attempt to create beliefs in you. Therefore, using it as creating beliefs is mistaken. The book is written to whom? The book is written to himself. Marcus Aurelius is practicing what Pierre Hadot called spiritual exercises. He is practicing psychotechnologies that are attempting to bring into awareness the co-identification process and co-transform the meaning of the world and the meaning of himself, as distinct from attempting to control and manipulate the world by accruing power and fame. And this was a particularly difficult problem for Marcus Aurelius, precisely because he had power and fame. He was the emperor. Many people consider him, I do as well, the greatest of the Roman emperors. He was the Roman Empire when it was still in ascendance. Generally, he's considered the last great emperor of that ascendance, and the beginning of the decline is marked when his son assumes the throne. The movie, well, in many ways, a fine movie, Gladiator, does not represent Marcus Aurelius well at all. Marcus Aurelius said something that really brings out both of these points. The challenge he faced and not getting enmeshed in power and fame because of the way power and fame fuse the meaning with the event. He famously said this: "It is possible to be happy even in a palace." And now you can think of the Buddha leaving the palace. Marcus Aurelius, unlike the Buddha, unlike the Cynics, doesn't leave the palace. He learns how to be happy even in a palace, because he does not want to shirk his moral responsibilities. So what are some of these practices you see him engaging in? One is a practice that Hadot calls objective seeing. I'm not quite happy with that term because of some of the associations with the word objective, but let us go on. Aurelius says, conceive of sex as the friction of two patches of skin and the production of a sticky fluid. And you go, ew, that's kind of like Diogenes in the marketplace. It's ew. Well, what's he doing there? What's he doing, and why is he doing it? He's married, he has children, so he's not a prude. Right? In fact, he loved his wife quite deeply. What's he doing? He's trying to get you to realize the event of sex as distinct from all of the meaning we pour into it. The event is friction between some patches of skin and the production of a sticky fluid. But we pour all of this into it. And there's all of this meaning. And he's not saying that meaning's wrong. That's not the point, any more than the being mode is good and the having mode is bad. He's not saying that. He's getting himself to realize, to enact, wait, there's a difference between the event and all of this meaning that I'm identifying with. All of this rules I'm assuming, all of the rules I'm assigning. Right? The Stoics would recommend get a cup that you're really attached to, a cup you really like. Start using it on a daily basis so that you really like it until it becomes very familiar, and then smash it. Because then you'll remember the distinction between the meaning and the thing. And if you can practice it with something that ultimately isn't that much of an event, with little things, then you can learn to do it with larger things. This leads to a practice that many people find distasteful for the Stoics. It's called premeditatio. When you're kissing your child goodnight, say to yourself, I may lose them to death tonight. Because you have to learn to distinguish the meaning from the physics. You have tremendous control over the meaning that you and your son are making together. You have very little control over the physics of his mortality. Yes, you can do things to protect him, and you should, but you can't move the universe. Look, we have got to remember this better. Sati. We have entire genres that distort and refuse together the meaning and the event. They are pervasive in our culture, and I think they're much more pernicious than we realize. The ubiquitous evil is always the most dangerous, right? These are romantic comedies. Because romantic comedies teach us that the narrative meaning we are assigning to things is aligned with, consonant with, in concert with the way the world is unfolding. So events will conspire to bring two people together. There will be difficulties, but the world will help them to realize until they finally end up together. Now, of course, we have tragedies to try and compensate that, but the romantic comedy teaches us the wrong. That's not how it works. I'm in love with an amazing woman. I admire her I admire her as a person. I'm just so deeply grateful to be in this relationship, and it's growing and growing. Right? And I'm, oh, this is fantastic. And I step out into the street and I don't notice a truck coming and it kills me. It doesn't care about my happiness. It doesn't care about my narrative. It doesn't care about all of that meaning that I'm making with her. It's real that we're making this meaning. It's part of our being mode. But it's not the same as the events that I'm experiencing. See, this leads to the Stoics' diagnosis. It's not mortality that makes us anxious, it's fatality. Now, here's another instance, and this I would recommend Weiser's book, Beyond Fate, where we've lost the meaning of a word. Because we associate that with mortality. Something that's fatal is something that has caused death. But that's not the root of the... Death is not the root of this word. The root of this word is fate. Now, there's two meanings to this. One is some sort of magical things are predestined by some supernatural force. I'm not talking about that meaning of fate. I'm talking about the way things are are fated to happen. They're just rolling from their own causal necessity. And here's the point. When we fuse these together, we become subject to the fatality of all things. Everything is fatal in that the meaning and the thing are not identical, and if we forget that, we will suffer when they come apart. Now I can explain to you the association. Why is this associated with death? Because death is where those come apart. Death is where the events of the universe and all of your meaning and all of your narrative and all of your identity radically become unglued. Death is fatal. It reveals to you, in the ultimate loss of agency, that meaning and event are not identical. What's another practice that the Stoics engage in? Practice they engaged in is called the view from above. The view from above. You can see Marcus Aurelius doing it in the Meditations. He says, imagine that instead of, and think about the Solomon effect that we talked about, moving from a first-person perspective to a third-person perspective. And there's all kinds of evidence about altering your level of construal, having these very powerful effects on your cognition and your sense of self. And so you're viewing some situation and you're enmeshed in it. Now view it higher up in space and time, and then higher up still in space. So not just here, but Oh, but situate this event. Situate this event within all of Toronto. Oh, no, situate it within all of Canada, within the whole world. Within not just the whole world now, but the whole world through all of time. What happens when you do that? Don't just say it, try it sometime. Visualize it, imagine yourself doing it. What happens is the agent arena is being altered, and all of this machinery is coming into your awareness, and your sense of self and your sense of what matters and what's important, what things mean, is being radically transformed. You'll become more liable to pursuing more long-term goals. You'll become more flexible. You become more capable of rational reflection, self-transformation. This is all evidenced from Construal level theory. See, a bunch of practices that are designed to get you to bring into awareness this process of meaning making and to give you the discernment to pull apart the meaning from the event. Most therapy is about getting people to see this perspectival change, perspectival knowing, and then to identify with it, change their sense of self, their sense of control, so that they move off trying to so much change the events that they can't control as much as they deeply, desperately want to cognitively reframing the meaning. And again, this isn't just semantic meaning. This is the identity, your participatory meaning, your existential mode. And this takes tremendous practice. The last thing you'll see Marcus Aurelius doing, and even more Epictetus, is the practice of actually internalizing Socrates, like Antisthenes talked about at the very beginning of this whole tradition. It means trying to do with yourself what Socrates had done with you. You can see this again in modern cognitive behavioral practices. You get people to stop and be Socratic with themselves. So the person is depressed. Remember I said when Antisthenes was talking about conversing with himself, he wasn't talking about the way you ruminate. Because when we ruminate, we're running things through our head. Like, everything I do is a failure. The therapist doesn't try and console the person and says, like, well, no, go out and get more success. He doesn't give the American commercial response. Well, go out and succeed more, conquer the world. Good luck with that. Okay? He says, well, she says, everything you do? Everything? Was you stating to me that that's a failure, itself a failure? Well, no, not everything. Did you get here successfully today? Well, yes, I did. What about clothing yourself? Oh, yes. So what do you mean by everything? I don't mean everything. What do you mean? Okay? And you realize a lot of this is because I'm letting this go by without having my own internal Socrates that stops me and says, oh, wow, you're making such powerful claims. You must know and understand. But you see, you're bullshitting yourself because this is very salient to you, but it's way beyond your understanding because it's not representing what you actually mean. This may be what you believe, but it can't be what you mean. Everybody hates me. Everybody? So everybody's out to get you. Well, no, not most people. Which people? Well, this person. They hate you? How do you know they hate you? Well, they said that, is that enough for hate? You can see Socrates here. Is that what you mean by hate? Tell me what you mean by it. You've got all these things salient in your mind and you're running them round and round and round, but you don't really understand the meaning. And you're bullshitting yourself. Your motivation and your arousal is way ahead of your understanding. And most importantly, because of that, the meaning and the event are confused together. And again, this is not just in your beliefs, this is in your very identity. By doing all of this, you're going to transform your capacity for interacting with the world. You're going to not fall prey to the absurdity, and we're going to come back to absurdity again, right? That's inflicted on you by the fatality of all things. Because if you can discern, and this is one of the key things of wisdom, is discerning, not just in thought, but in perspective and in identity, the difference between the meaning and the events, and properly identify, by meaning properly sensing and calibrating your sense of control, then you will alter your sense of identity. How? And how could this possibly give an answer to the mortality of things that the Epicureans gave a direct answer to? Well, let's play with that a little bit. A bit of a view from above. Let's say I gave you immortality. You got it. What would you do with it? Well, I do all the things I'd like to do. Okay, great. What would you do? Well, I'd have lots of sex and eat lots of chocolate. Okay, how long? Well, probably not very long. I'd get bored. Then what would we do? Oh, I'd pursue more meaningful things. Well, what? Like I've always wanted to learn archery. I'd take up archery, and then I'd get really good at archery. Great. Then what? Well, really good at basketball. Yeah, and then what? Really good at... There's a really good story by, it's a chapter in a book, The History of the World in 9.5 Chapters by Julian Barnes, where people go to heaven, and what they're doing in heaven is they're given what they think is immortality, and this is one guy, he practices golf until he's getting a score of 18, right? And then he's sort of like, okay, what do I do now? What do I do? And then he comes to sort of St. Peter and he says, like, what's going on? And he says, what's wrong? Aren't you doing everything you want? I am, but I get great at everything. And then St. Peter says, well, yeah, so what? He says, well, I'm kind of done. And then St. Peter says, now you get the point of heaven. The point of heaven isn't to live out immortality, it is to make you accept death. Now, that's not classic Christian doctrine by any means. It's a great story. And it epitomizes the Stoic idea. As long as you are formulating your identity horizontally in terms of a narrative of achieving an unending duration to your life, you're going to fail. But even if I gave it to you, and this is what people need to stop and think about, it would fail. What you want is that moment that guy in heaven has. Right? You want not a length of life, but a fullness, a depth. You want to have lived life as fully as possible. This is why Marcus Aurelius says, everybody dies, but not everybody has lived. People quote that, and they think it's about sort of gusto or something like this. Right? That's not what it's meant. This is the access of fame and fortune, the having mode. There's nothing wrong with it. But this is the access of self-transcendence, the being mode. What do you identify with? Is your identity here? Or do you identify here? And if you identify here and you practice prochiron and prososh, you can get this fullness of being. Remember, that's what Plato promised. You could come to a complete fullness. And even if it lasts a moment, that's enough. Because it's not based on duration, it's based on quality. If I can achieve that in this moment, right here, right now, then I'm done. Then I'm done. So the Stoics have an answer that in a somewhat watered down form is still very powerfully effective, at least in our therapeutic endeavors, which are becoming more and more central to many people's lives because of the meaning crisis. But a less watered down version is also existentially pertinent and relevant. We can come to realize that I can exercise much more control over the meaning making, such that I get the one thing that is always good to have, which is wisdom, that can afford me an identity in the depths, an ontological identity, rather than a merely historical identity. And that would be a fulfilled life. And that is actually what I want. I'll speak personally now for a moment. I mean, at a physiological level, of course, I avoid death. I don't step into traffic, and I'm enjoying my life. So I don't mean this in any morbid or depressive way, but I do not want to live forever. Right? I do not want to live forever. I do not think that John Vervaeke should exist for all time. I think that would be an ontological mistake of astronomical proportions. In some ways, I'm tired of life. I'm tired of the ways in which I've been foolish, the ways I've been immoral, let myself and other people down. And I have a strong sense of the inevitability of that. And extending that through all of eternity strikes me as a horrible evil to inflict on reality. And that one I myself do not want to bear. But have I seen glimpses of this? Yes, I have. And we know from when people have awakening experiences that give them this, that they lose their fear of their mortality. They lose that existential anxiety. And if that's coupled to a fullness of being, that would be a way of responding to not only our mental health issues, but our existential distress about our own individual mortality. So you can see with both the Epicureans and the Stoics that we have things analogous, different but analogous to the kinds of things we saw at work within Buddhism. And we can see that the West is building up this very powerful tradition in its own right. And one of the great things about Pierre Hadot's work, and I recommend it very strongly to you, like What is Ancient Philosophy, or Philosophy as a Way of Life, is to remind us that we do not have to look to Asian history, Asian, not ancient. We do not have to look to the East for the psychotechnologies of self-transcendence and self-transformation. There's no reason not to. We should. But we should not do that because we believe there is nothing within the Western heritage that offers us a profound response to the quest for meaning, wisdom, self-transcendence, and a response to existential anxiety. We have those things. Now, one of the things that has been happening, and I think it is a good thing, although is indicative of the increase of the meaning crisis in the West, is there has been a rediscovery of Stoicism, Platonism, etc. Part of what we need to do, and that's what I've been trying to do with you, is integrate that with our current cognitive science so that, once again, we can learn how to, and I mean this in a deeply, spiritually deep way, salvage from our own tradition the psychotechnologies and practices of wisdom and meaning making that we are going to need, but in a way that we can live within a scientific worldview. So, the Hellenistic period comes to an end with the advent of a return to a world empire, which in very many ways, right, is going to be informed by the axial revolution, but in very many ways also represents a return to a pre-axial world. Namely, a world in which eventually a man can be considered a god because he wields so much power, the Roman emperors. And power and prosperity are the primary ways in which wisdom is understood. But within that empire, all of these philosophies will find home, and eventually, as we noted with Marcus Aurelius, even the emperor himself will be a proponent and an exemplar of the legacy of the axial revolution. But something else is also happening with the advent of this empire in the Mediterranean. And we return back now, as I promised we would, to one of the areas in which the axial revolution had taken place. And this, of course, is ancient Israel. Because what's happening is, of course, Israel is now been conquered by a sequence of empires. And the most recent, of course, is the Roman Empire. And I want to now speak of a religion that emerges at this time. It's not an axial religion, but it is deeply informed by the axial legacy, particularly the ancient Israel legacy, where the two worlds were understood, if you remember, in terms of moving from the land of slavery to the promised land, where the real world is the future and God is this open creator, and we're trying to sense the Ath, have faith in, participatory knowing of, involvement in the course of history, and sometimes we're distorted in that and we trespass, we fall off course, and we have to be redeemed, we have to be brought back on course by prophets who speak God's attempt to get us back on track with making the future. This whole idea of co-creating with God the open future such that we can bring about a promised land for human beings. Now there is a person, a Jewish person, who is born into that tradition and is responsible in ways that are very hard to determine historically for a radical transformation. Right? And of course, this is Jesus of Nazareth. And probably the most pretentious thing I'm going to do is trying to speak about Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, literally, many millions of people believe he was God. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally, metaphysically. I am respectful of this fact. I don't agree with it, at least in very standard interpretations. My endeavor is to not try and give some final complete version of this. That would be hubris and arrogance on my part. My endeavor is to try and explain what Jesus via Christianity did to that Israelite axial legacy, because that is what is relevant to what we are discussing here and now. The battles, the interminable and I think ultimately undecidable battles, even though many people claim to have reached the final conclusion about who Jesus was and what Jesus did, are not something I'm going to try and resolve here. We're even going to see when we take a look at the Gnostics that there is, right from the beginning, multiple competing interpretations and how that has had deep historical influence. So, if you remember, we used a Greek term from Paul Tillich, because the New Testament, the part of the Bible that talks about Jesus and the advent of Christianity, was actually written in Greek. So Tillich, the same Paul Tillich who wrote The Courage to Be, talked about kairos, about that perspectival participatory knowing, knowing the fullness of time, knowing exactly the right time. So some, right, that are going to, the right timing to shift the course of events. What Pascal, when we come to Pascal, we'll talk about is the spirit of finesse. The right, you're not yet in a romantic relationship with Susan, and you kiss her, and is it the right time? If you get the timing right, if the kairos is right, then the course of your relationship is altered, transformed, and your identity and her identity changed. Now, the Israelite conception was for the whole nation, and God would intervene kairotically at moments in history. Christianity is going to propose this radical idea that God's creative logos, the word he speaks through the prophets, that it's the same word by which he speaks things into existence, the word that helps create history, the word that causes kairos, makes kairos possible for us. So logos doesn't mean just spoken words. It means like the intelligibility, the formative principle, the underlying structure. Christianity, it's in the Gospel of John, anarche and logos. In the beginning was the logos. A passage actually probably lifted from Stoicism. But what is John appropriating it to say? He's saying that God's capacity for producing kairos through logos has been identified, or to use an older term, incarnated in a particular individual. That Jesus of Nazareth is actually the ultimate kairos, that all the other kairoses were pointing to him and are summed up in him. That he represents the ultimate turning point. And he represents it not only historically, he represents it personally. Because he is a person, you can identify with him, and that kairos can come to take place in you personally. Just like Socrates personalizes the axial revolution and brings it into a direct personal confrontation, the encounter with Jesus means that you too can experience a profoundly personal kairos, which Jesus seems to have spoken about using a metaphor of being born again, about such a radical metanoia, a radical shifting. This is often translated as conversion, until you read about that, right? But this word is much closer to awakening. Noia means noticing. This is your perspectival awareness. And meta means beyond. This means a radical transformation in your salience landscape, a radical transformation of, right, what it's like to be you. It's this deeply perspectival and participatory transformation. And Jesus is saying he incarnates the principle by which you can intervene in your own personal history, or by which maybe you want to say intervention can occur in your own personal history, such that this metanoia. You will have a new mind, a new heart, a new modal existence. You will be born again. What's going on there? What does this kairos look like? What could possibly so radically transform my salience landscape, my sense of self, my processes of co-identification? What could bring that about? And now I'm going to say the word, and then you're going to laugh because it sounds like a Hallmark card. The Christian answer is love, and now we all titter. Ha 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 ha. That's so quaint. Ha ha. Love. Sounds like, oh, love. Okay. The problem with that, as you've seen many times, is that this word is trivialized for us. We use one word to talk about so many different things, like I love peanut butter cookies. I love Canada. I love Sarah. I love my son. I love a really good, right, game of tennis. Are those the same? We're even confused about this. We think that love is an emotion. No, it's not. Love is a modal way of being. Love isn't a feeling, and it is not an emotion. How do I know this? Because loving someone can be expressed by being sad when they're absent, being happy when they're present, being jealous when there's somebody else around, being angry when they're neglecting you. Love isn't a feeling. It isn't an emotion. It is a modal way of being. It is an agent-arena relationship. And what Jesus seemed to be incarnating as a kairos to change the history of the world and to offer you to change your own personal history is a different kind of love. This is agape. We have to distinguish between three kinds of love: eros, philia, and agape. See, eros is the love that seeks to be one with something. And that can be spiritual, like being one with nature, or it can be being one with a cookie by eating it. Of course, we come to think of eros erotically, right? Being one with somebody by having sex with them. Right? But remember, Socrates knew ta erotica, which wasn't just sex. Socrates knew what to care about. This is philia. So this is the love that is satisfied through consummation. Philia, this is the love that seeks cooperation. This is the love in which we experience reciprocity. We love the cookie because we can consume it. We love our friends because we are in reciprocity with them. What kind of love is this? And this is what Jesus claimed was how God loved individuals. This is the love that a parent has for a child. This is not the love of consummation. You're not trying to consume the child. That's evil. And it's not friendship. You're not, like, when you bring a child home from the hospital, and I've done this twice, right? That's not your friend. It's not even a person. You can't, it's basically a slug. But here's the astonishing thing. You love it. Not because of any way you can consume it or be one with it. Ew. Ew. You don't love it because, hey, what, great friendship. You love it, right? You love it because by loving it, you turn a non-person into a person. It's the closest thing to a miracle, and that sounds hackney, I know, but stop back and think about this. You depend on agape. It's because people loved you before you were a person that you have become the person you are. Love turns non-person animals into moral agent persons. It's like it's like somehow if I could just care about, right, my sofa enough, it would turn into a Ferrari or something. It's that powerful. And here's what Jesus was offering. That love can be made, it can be exacted and made available for all. Here's what is on offer. Here's why Christianity will take the Roman Empire culturally. With agape, Christianity can say to all of the non-persons of the Roman Empire, all the women, all the children, all the non-male citizens, all the sick, all the poor, all the widowed, can take all of those non-persons and say, we will turn you into persons. Persons that belong to the kingdom of God. We'll take another look at this in more detail next time. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Alrighty then, we are going to take, where's my timer, where is it? We're going to take 10 minutes. Actually, I'll just put the timer on now. Yeah, 10 minutes, and then we'll be right back, and we'll do the discussion. If you guys want to jump into the call right now, that would be great. And you can do that by going to futurethinkers.org/discuss. So we'll see you there.
for a sec then.
All right. All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. Hey guys, welcome back. It's Daddy's turn to babysit right now, so he's gonna be chilling here during the conversation. I might turn the video off, just so he's not too distracting here. But I did want to show you this. Look at this. Look what we received. That's a Rebel Wisdom shirt sent from Alex and Dave. Alex is convinced that the baby's named after him. All right, so I'll turn my video off here, but I'll be in the background. Yeah, I know you want to participate too.
So, does anyone want to start by what was most alive for them in this lecture? Something that really jumped out.
I'll go. So I took a couple of notes here. I thought it was just amazing how much of the meaning crisis and identity politics and spiritual and personal trauma is about over-identification. Like people are trying to alter the meaning of events by altering the events themselves instead of how they feel about the events. I can just see it everywhere, and I'm paying so much attention to it right now, and I'm just glad that he brought that up. I wish I knew how to communicate it better, and I know that the way he's communicated it too, it's going to be hard, because I even hearing meaning versus event, right? I'm confused by what meaning even means, and I had to do my own definition of it and search for what that means to people.
Yeah, I think part of it is that a lot of people have just never done that investigation. They don't realize that the meaning of something is actually separate from the event itself. And I mean, the example that he gave was Marcus Aurelius's meditation on what is sex. And it's quite graphic, but it's hilarious. It's just like two bodies rubbing together until you get a sticky liquid. And of course, that's not what it is. There's so much kind of, emotional content, spiritual content, physiological arousal, history, personal narrative involved. And so all that stuff is meaning. And it's funny if we dig deeper into this, like the differentiation between the two, the line is a bit blurry of what is the event and what is the meaning, because even how we describe events is always loaded with our own concepts and preconceptions and cultural background and personal history. So no matter how we describe an event, it's always going to be somewhat muddied with meaning. So it's kind of hard to strip things down to what is just the pure event. But I think as a continuum, it's a useful distinction, if that makes sense. Like, what is the kind of physical thing that is happening, and what is the conceptual layer that we're adding onto it?
Yeah, really. I wrote down, I will have to watch this again because it seems very important. I need to absorb it a little bit better, and it seems exactly where I'm stuck, where I've written this, where I'm spiraling around, sort of chasing the meaning, chasing the event, going back again to the beginning, maybe a little bit more insight, back around again, but I see them, I don't see them as separate. It's sort of the first time I really even realized it. It's sort of one thing that I'm trying to more fully understand. And this was just mind-blowing for me to give me another way to sort of, I mean, I'm looking at it from the perspective of analyzing it, understanding it, but another way to, I guess, to feel it, to understand what's going on. Great. To try to circle, to try to, you know, because I just spiral around a little bit more information, spiral around again, a little bit more information, and maybe this will be a way to break that.
Yeah, it's interesting that he mentions that this was one of the core Stoic practices, and now it's the core of psychotherapy. So it's a technique that seems to have withstood the test of time, is picking apart the event from the meaning. And if an event is bothering you, then it's better to dig into the meaning and rewrite the meaning rather than trying to change the event, because a lot of the time people don't have control over events, especially if they're in the past. Then you have no control.
Meanwhile, that's damn hard.
Yeah.
Because all of us, we have had probably really bad things happening to us. And I can feel somewhat, it's not shame, but it's like I should be grown enough to do this, what he talks about. They always separate the meaning from the actual event. But it's damn hard when you're struck with the harsh reality of being a human. So any tips you can give me, if because you know we live in a society where meaning and things and relationships and everything, they are so tightly merged. You see it all around. We are bombarded by these messages of romantic love and of owning things and of everything, and to separate them. You do that when you die, he says, but we don't need to wait that long, I guess. So, but it's for me, it's damn hard. I'm striving for it, but if you have succeeded, please tell me.
I think it's the hardest thing you can do. It's what we've talked about so much in the course calls, of like sacrificing things to a fire, that sacrificing your identities and your attachments to a fire, to become something that is, to find out what exactly is you at the very base level of your experience and your consciousness. And that means separating yourself from the things you both are afraid of and the things that you love as well. I truly believe it's the most difficult thing you can ever do.
Yeah,
but it's very simple. I think it's very simple, the process itself. You just it just requires a lot of courage.
Yeah, and it's very unpleasant until it's not.
There's another part here that I want to name, which is the possibility and the potential to over-rotate in the other direction. And I think about Sam Harris to some extent in this, but I think about almost becoming too reliant on the objective, almost trying, just as Marcus Aurelius talks about, sex is really just two patches of skin and fluid, that is, in some sense, that's not the intention, isn't to go to the purely objective. And I mentioned Sam Harris not because he goes that far, but because he thinks that he views any kind of religion or mysticism in the same way that John Vervaeke might view romanticism, right? As kind of an merging, over connectedness, over binding between meaning and event. And so I want to say something else, but I want to pause and see, does that ring true for other people as well? That there's that I think this is part of the difficulty of the middle way, is not over binding meaning and event and not completely separating them either, right? It's the I think to what you're saying, UV, is true. There is physiologically, emotionally, evolutionarily some attachment there, and it changes over time. That inclusion of the ontological identity is a thing that shifts, and there isn't some right place to be as an objective reality that we're supposed to get to. It's really, this is where, when he's talking about Kairos, the right time for where you're at, not the right time as a static point in time.
Yeah. And I mean, he talks about it as a participatory point in time. So it's the moment that feels right, that appears right according to your relationship with the environment. So it's not purely internal either. And actually, I just wanted to add for the Marcus Aurelius's example with separating the event from the meaning in sex. I don't think he was talking about stripping away all the meaning, because of course then you lose all the beauty, and then what's the point? Like, you know, you could be rubbing a towel on a dirty table. I think he was talking about understanding the distinction.
And I
agree,
think
and
he
that's
oversimplified to create an example as well.
Yeah, just to create a visceral extreme example that would illustrate for people what he's talking about.
right. And I think it's a beautiful example to illustrate the possibility of going too far. Vervaeke didn't call attention to that, but I know that, I imagine that there are some people who will watch that and think, oh, that's the objective. Just remove all the meaning from that to get to the pure essence of what's true. I say that as an extreme. Even I don't know that people would even say that that's the objective, that you should see sex in that way. But I'm noticing, what I'm noticing is partly informed by where I'm at and the insights that I'm gaining from reading The Master and His Emissary, the Miguel Crist book, because of the way in which the left hemisphere, the left brain, is parasitic on the right. The left brain wants to understand things through objective definition. It wants to know what the true objective thing is down at the root of it all. How can I reductionistically get down to like something like, okay, maybe I don't want to reduce everything down to 2 patches of skin and fluid, but I want to know that's the starting point. Like, build everything up from there. And this is, you can't get to where you really are really by a pure bottom up, starting from the bottom process. It's simultaneously bottom up and top down at the right point, at the right time, always. It's nice to know the extremes, but it's not a, you know, that's where I say Sam Harris, I think, tends towards that. He wants to start with objective reality. Let's get down to the bare minimum base metal. What can we know for sure is objective truth that nobody can dispute, and then build up our propositions from there. It's like you're gonna get lost if you do that.
I also think that that's a flawed approach, and I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the book The Case Against Reality, that argues that our whole sense of reality is a complete construct in our minds, and we have no way of knowing what actual reality is. It might be completely different because our perception of reality is not based on perceiving truth or reality, for that matter. It's based on evolutionary fittedness. We're seeing things in a way that helped us, our ancestors, survive and pass on their genes and raise healthy children. So from that perspective, trying to get down to objective reality or start at objective reality is kind of a thing that's doesn't have an end point, because, well, we can't know because our perception is not perfect.
I love that you brought that up, and I'm curious, Mike, from your perspective as well, just in noticing that it's a very good book to read, to recognize the futility of trying to get down to bare metal reality and build up from there. It's not possible, and yet recognizing that what we're experiencing is the user interface for that, right? Is our projection of that, allows for the widening of the ontological identity. So it's a very interesting, I mean, watching people argue with Donald Hoffman about you can't be right. You know, what you're saying is that none of this exists. And he goes, no, not saying it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the way that you perceive it to exist, and can't. You can't clear the doors of perception so much that you actually get to see the actual under reality underlying all of this. That's not possible. There's no end to that.
For
which
me,
is a very
sorry, I thought you were finished there. For me, one of the worst delusions is, well, I think the height of delusion is believing something is true when it simply isn't. And so I think a lot of this deconstructive process about truth is not about finding necessarily what is true. It's about negating everything that is not. So I think that's a very important process to... It's hard to say what the benefit of it is, aside from not being unconsciously possessed by ideologies or by biological drives or any number of different things that cause you to act in unconscious ways. But the idea that you get some right answer at the end of it, I don't believe that's the purpose of it necessarily, unless you go all the way, which is not fun and not easy and not recommended, you know, but at least getting free of some amount of delusion over things that you believe to be true. That's, to me, where the value in this is. It's not to find out what is right ultimately.
I feel like it's helpful to, and I think he mentioned this. Yeah, he did. Helpful to look at it from the point of view of, like, event and meaning is an easy way to think about it, but of separating things that we have no possibility of having control over from things that we could control. And that somehow that, I think, gets away a little bit from that final truth idea of event, right? It's just like, no, there's certain things that are outside my agency, no matter how far I can go in the direction of agency. If I exercised all possible agency, I could still not alter X, Y, and Z. Then those things are not things I need to pay attention to with, well, they're actually, in a way, they're not relevant, because if I can't change them, then really my relevance realization needs to focus on the things I can change.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this actually, separating the event from the meaning, actually relates to the process of sovereignty as defined by Paul, where he identifies 3 layers instead of 2. It's perception, sense making, and agency. And so within those 3 layers, we have different amounts of, you could say, control, or we could have a different effect on that layer. So for perception, you know, it's just stimulus coming in. So we could maybe choose to observe things more closely in our visual field, or to listen more closely, or, you know, things like that. But we don't have control over the actual input that's coming in. And then for sense making, we can use different frameworks to understand things. So that's more closely related to the meaning. Like, oh, does it mean this, or does it mean this? Is the person yelling because it's really noisy in the room? Are they yelling because they're mad? Are they yelling because they just, you know, ran up the stairs and they're just out of breath? You know, are they yelling because they're mad because they had a bad day, or are they mad at me? So that's sense making or meaning making. And then agency is what can we do about it? So interesting how those 2 things are related. I just realized this.
Yeah, it's something that occurred to me too as I was watching it. You know, I noted in the comments in the YouTube channel that a wizard or wise one, right, is effectively someone who has mastered sovereignty, the interdependency of those three dimensions of being and meaning, and that there's something really powerful about that and the recognition of it, and there's something in me here that like is where I'm tempted to go with this feels like a very heady extreme view, and I'm not sure that it's of interest for everybody. It's something that's deeply interesting for me, but how it comes back more tangibly to the beginning of my thoughts at the video, I'm coming from a place of I'm looking a lot at what is the purpose, what is the functional value evolutionarily of shame, and noticing that there is a deep intertwining of meaning and event as part of the cultural aspect of this, and that it builds up over time, that there is a kind of there's a kind of friction, an existential friction that allows the movement of something, but then it's like that movement can't, that attachment of meaning, the graspability of meaning and event does allow the movement of something through time, but then it has to let go and shift in order for something else to grab hold of. You can't hold on to it forever, and you don't want a frictionless environment where there's no grabbing, but you want a kind of a graspingness that happens for a while to move things, and then a release and a regrasping until you get to the point of it's very nuanced grasping and releasing all the time. And I think that is effectively what sovereignty and mastery looks like, is it gets to the point of knowing and kind of mindfully knowing how long an attachment is useful, right? Rather than trying to solve it existentially for all time. I think this speaks a little bit to what Saul was saying in the comments in the YouTube about this discussion. Sort of makes him a little bit uneasy as someone who wants to think about escaping, living forever. It's like, yeah, the notion that we can escape suffering by achieving immortality misses something really potent. It's like that's a blind spot that we have, that we think that actually solves our suffering. It actually is creating our hell, right?
I loved what he said about heaven being, what did he say? Meant to help you accept death, meaning
Yeah.
the perpetual achieving of all the things you ever dreamed would get boring, and eventually you'd want to die anyway. If you had pure bliss in heaven forever, you would still want an end to it out of sheer boredom.
David, I just wanted to get a bit clear on what you were saying. That are you suggesting that coupling meaning and event together and then pulling them apart is actually a flexibility capacity? Yeah, okay. So like zoom in, zoom out, it's similar to that. Interesting.
Well,
Yeah, I
there's
was
something
thinking
here
the same.
that
Mhm.
I'm wondering if it at all presupposes the idea that you will absolutely act differently if you leave them separately. If you've detached the meaning in the event, can you still be a good parent? Can you still be a good spouse? Can you still act in the world in the appropriate ways without having any attachment? And I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah.
I
would guess-
disagree.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would guess no. And I'm really glad that David brought this up, because I think that it is exactly that oscillation and its optimal grip. Finding the optimal spot in that oscillation at the right moment in this point in time, that is the wizardry. That's the skillfulness, because we can't not identify with anything. If you don't have an ego at all, then you're psychotic. Like it's not possible to live without having a sense of self, without identifying with something in the moment. It's I think it's more about knowing that you are identifying with this thing and being able to disidentify when it's no longer useful.
Interesting. So I'm speaking specifically about attachment though. And I don't know if that's maybe something I semantically got wrong here, but I mean, can you be non-attached? And to me, that's, and maybe it's an incorrect assumption here, but that would be the separation of those things, of meaning and event. It doesn't mean meaning evaporates. It just means when the event collapses something that is meaningful to you, you let go of it. It's not, the meaning can persist without the event. Do you know what I mean? Or you can let go of it altogether. Like there's something, I'm more specifically speaking about non-attachment.
So just to clarify, not attachment of what to what? Because
A desire for an outcome, a desire for a thing to be a certain way.
Okay. That, yeah. So that maybe in that sense.
So it's like if you, I don't know, like I think it's best to give a top shelf example because it's the way we can pull this apart the easiest. If you are unattached to the outcome of raising your child, can you still be a good mother or father?
I don't think so.
Don't think so.
Well,
No.
so yeah, and I would say here's an interesting thing, right? It's I think that I hear what you're pointing to, Mike, and I think that it is something like unhealthy attachment as distinguished from any attachment. I think that if I eliminate all attachment, I just sit in a pile and evaporate into atoms. I don't think that I do anything at that point. I just let entropy take its course, right? And there are people, evidently, who meditate in caves to the point of reaching that, right? And they give up all agency because what's the point of agency? Agency isn't necessary if there's zero attachment. If there's no friction, there's no movement. And so that's kind of the extreme of going to one end. And I think that's distinguished from what you're noting of unhealthy attachment of kairos is the exact right amount of attachment so that it always moves just the right amount of things, just the right amount of distance, right? Which is
I'm playing with this
I'll
as an
give an
extreme
example,
because
maybe.
am I muted? No, I'm playing with this as an extreme because I think it's a good way to find the answer because I'm not convinced about it being one way or the other. Like I have an assumption that you could do it or you can engage in love without attachment. In fact, I think love is almost better or expanded or more encompassing without attachment. And maybe that's the distinction is the unhealthy attachment. But I don't know if the distinction is necessary for unhealthy or healthy attachment. I think non-attachment, period. And my assumption is, and I have no proof behind this, that you could still engage in all of the things, all the responsibilities and the demands of life and still be functional. I mean, even so many of the texts, like so much in Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity even is just like, is about letting go of even that. I forget what the story was when God asks one of the characters to murder his son to prove his love for God. It's like there's so much about this pushing this non-attachment thing for something. Maybe in that situation it's for love of God, but
So there it is, because it's not complete non-attachment. It's like, what would you rather be attached
what would you
to?
sacrifice?
Yeah. And even in Buddhism, like, I agree with what David was saying. Like, the extreme of non-attachment is basically just dying, because then you are no longer driven to get food or even breathe or do anything, because if you're not.
I don't agree with that. I think that presupposes too much. I think you can get enjoyment out of things, but let them pass easily. I think you can decide why not not die today, and do that every day.
I would agree with Mike, and maybe I shouldn't frame it as I would agree with Mike, but I'll frame it as
That's dangerous. I swing hard sometimes.
David, when you were talking about unhealthy attachment, that strikes me as right, but also your description of monks in a cave strikes me as unhealthy non-attachment, so that we can talk about both in that way. And I mean, I can't know any of these things because I haven't experienced total non-attachment, but I have a sense that attachment doesn't equal, it's a bad word, but will. So that not being attached to eating doesn't mean you won't have the will to eat.
Yes.
Just means if you couldn't eat, you wouldn't suffer.
We actually talked about this, or it was Maria on Twitter, about looking for, it was intention was the word I would use. To me, there's all of existence is almost like a vector. It's a point, to me, a point of consciousness, like your point of view, and intention which is the arrow that moves you in a direction. It's just a dot and a line with an arrow at the end. That, to me, that is, I've never been able to divide experiential consciousness, existence, anything more than that. That's the bedrock of what I've been able to. I am conscious, I know that, and I can have intention, I know that. The rest of it seems to be untrue. So with that, you can act with intention without attachment.
So maybe it's just the definition of attachment that is the sticky.
Possibly. What do you think, David?
I suspect that's true. As I'm hearing you say intention, my mind looks at what does the internal tendency or the tension between something, that frictionful versus frictionless, and there's something of the attachment which I see as I'm looking at it a more atomistic way, a very low level. What's the base most thing about attachment? And it's not. When I think of absolute non-attachment, I think of absolute frictionlessness. Nothing can grasp anything at that point. And so intention doesn't actually have any impact either, right? In a sense, I almost can't be an intention at that point. And it's I think it's somewhat semantic, so I don't want to get stuck on it. I don't want to convince anybody of it, but it does feel like a useful poll for me to be able to consider that. It helps me more contemplate right action, right intention, right, all of that, the middle path, right, the middle way. What is that?
That brings in morality in relation to positive attachment, which I do believe in what I've described. It has the potential to be very dysfunctional in society, to not have positive attachments and then to have any kind of will that is not socially in line. That's pure psychopathy. That's as bad as it can possibly get. So I'm not saying it's good. It results in anything good. I'm just asking the question, can it still be functional? Which I think it can.
I want to name something here, is that there's a concern in me that it gets so heady in trying to figure out what it is that we might miss the applicability of it. And
Sure.
For me, one of the reasons that this app is applicable right now, and the whole reason for the arising of the Meaning Crisis lecture series and why we're here, is in some way this difference that he mentions between the historical identity and the ontological identity. This thing is happening at a cultural level. So the morality that happens is confused in a way. We are confused at a cultural, collective, civilizational level to an extent that we're approaching a point where it can no longer, that grip can no longer be held. Holding that grip is an existential endpoint. We have to let go of that collectively in order to reunite with the sense of agent arena interaction of our species and the planet. And that is going to force individual letting go of that as well. That can't happen at the collective level without it happening at the individual level. And so that interaction, that's why this is an important question. And it's important to work it out specifically. What does it mean for you? Not what does it mean as objectively true for everybody. There isn't that place. It's how is it mattering for you?
Well, one of the reasons I'm wanting, or I have tried to take it to an extreme place, is I'm trying to find the boundary of what is appropriate for society or individuals to move past the meaning crisis. What is the appropriate level of non-attachment? It's not that I'm advocating going all the way with that, but it's like, but I think if this is something worth investigating and worth applying in one's life, it's also worth defining where too much is too much, or where it's just enough. Like, what is that? And
I think it.
maybe
ahead,
the
Heather.
distinction of just healthy attachment, unhealthy attachment, but I don't exactly understand that distinction. And I think maybe I would get caught up in semantics and specifics and get too heady about it, but I'm pretty sure in a lot of cases I could find contradictions in how we would define what is good attachment and what is not. So it's like that's kind of why I'm pushing this to the extreme.
For me,
I feel like it. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Go ahead. I was going to say, for me, just the concept of separating the event from the meaning, which is where we sort of started here, is really important. And there isn't necessarily going to be, it won't be the same for everybody. Everybody's going to have different places where they need to be separated and understand different things from that separation. And I don't know that there needs to be sort of a final answer for that. There are going to be events that are really important, really dramatic, life-changing. There are going to be events that are like you bump into somebody at the grocery store and wonder whether it was purposeful or not. And that sort of within that continuum is where you can open up to what the meaning in your own life is. And I'm not so sure that we need to have kind of the final answer for that to go forward, for us to do that.
You actually just answered the question enough for me to be done with it, which is having the distinction between the two, between the meaning and the event. I mean, that you started at the beginning of the conversation, John, saying that was a big realization. So having the ability to distinguish between the two, I mean, as I'm testing that in my head, that seems right.
I think it's about the process rather than the thing, and it's more about understanding that this is a process. And same thing with attachment, like attaching and disattaching as a process that you know how to apply appropriately in Kairos, in the right moment, with the right amount of force.
I am talking about process, though, just to clarify.
Maybe a skill would be another. I mean, a skill that you can learn and you can improve and you can get better at, and and also he talked about rumination, which is almost like the 21st century disease that we have, that we're drilling, or I have, drilling and reworking and replaying and reanalyzing, and to be able to sort of just take the needle off of that album and put it aside, I'm happy with that today,
Nice.
if I can do that.
Heather, what were you gonna say about this?
I was gonna say it brings to mind the old sort of awakening is not enough thing, that the appropriate level of non-attachment for someone is in line with their other areas of development. So that if you pursue just this one line of non-attachment to the end, you can end up incredibly dysfunctional if your other lines of development have not been pursued.
Ah.
But at the same time, if you don't pursue it at all and you develop along other lines, you can end up suffering a lot and be very dysfunctional. So it's a matter of context and the whole of development, I think.
Right. So we're getting into kind of Ken Wilber territory here.
Or in
also-
in terms of Nora Bateson, like it's all relational, and it's about kind of seeing where you're situated in relation to all these different things and different ways of looking at life, or different lines of development or whatever.
Lynn and Apostle, you guys have been quiet. I wonder if you have anything to add here.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you, do you equate non-attachment with the disconnection of meaning, or you see them as different things? Because non-attachment for me would be just another, I don't know, map or way of sense making of the situation. So
It would be a desire for an outcome, or a grasping an attachment in a very kind of real physical sense, not wanting to let something go. That can be something physical, like a baby overprotecting, or it could be a concept or a piece of your identity, but just this unwillingness to let something go, I would say, which is so that's distinguished from the event and the meaning. It's like the meaning to me, like separating them is necessary to gain non-attachment. First of all, that's like you can't do it otherwise.
Yeah.
So, but they're different. Yeah.
And yeah, the idea is that maybe separating from a specific meaning that you infused at one point about the situation, disattaching from it, and then maybe working with different models, and maybe understanding if it's useful to attach to some other meaning about the event. That's the that's what I'm thinking about. That you can just stay at non-attachment, like I'm not attached to that specific meaning, but then you can move to, okay, is this other meaning more better for it, for the event that happened? And yeah, that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about.
Well, I do agree with David. This has the potential to go way too deep into semantics and not really be helpful. So yeah, as far as I've defined it there, I would just leave it at that. That's where I see the distinction. Lynn, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
I've never used the Zoom thing, so I don't even know if it's working.
It's working. We can hear you. Ta-da!
Oh, the most important thing that John said today for me was quality of life matters. And quality of life, he had mentioned that between the complicated stuff and the Jesus stuff. And so that's what I like the best. It is, quality of life is the most important thing. So that's the thing that lit up for me.
Rather than the quantity. Yeah, he talks about it as a cure for overcoming fear of death, is just to live life fully.
something that comes to mind here that's really beautiful. Another conversation that I've had over the past week on the Game Bee discussion group, or there have been a couple of conversations about Vervaeke, and noticing that some people, this is an interesting contradiction. Some people can't stand to watch him speak. They can't watch the videos. They can only listen. Some people can't even stand to listen to him. They can only read it. They can only read transcripts. If they're watching it, the movement and the emphasis and the tone that he uses distracts them from actually hearing him. And for me, it's just the opposite. If I'm only listening or only reading, I'm not getting it. I have to watch him. And I've tried listening, and it's like I have to go back and watch it again because I don't pick it up. So there's something noticing that I would say maps roughly to kinesthetic versus auditory versus visual learning. So that makes good sense that there's neurologically some way that sense making happens, that there are preferences that certain people orient towards. So that's one thing that is really interesting. The other discussion that was interesting is in Vervaeke's attempt to find a religion that's not a religion, it offends people who find value in religion. And I noticed in the comments someone who was bringing up the Quran and Allah, and it makes me think that people who do get value from religion are offended that we would try to do away with it. And one of the comments that I made in that, as I was looking at that, I was like, oh, I'm noticing there's something like there are some people who get value out of a traditional religious context. There's other people who get value out of a scientific context. And there's some other people that get a value in a different way, right? In this practical kind of context. It's neither necessarily scientific nor religious, but or mystical, but practical. And I said it's as if we had 3 apples and 3 people and passing them around, each person take a slice of each apple and taste it. And they can all agree that one of the apples is disgusting and bitter, like inedible. One of the apples is bland. It seems to have no flavor at all. And one of the apples is the absolute best thing they've ever tasted in their life. They can't believe how good it is. The only thing is, each of them disagree about which apple is which. And the notion that we have that we should agree on which apple is kind of this notion about attachment. I recognize that the way that Mike is orienting to attachment may be different than the way that I orient to attachment, and we don't need to agree about that. So that's part of where I think we get lost in the semanticness of it and recognize, oh, there's something that fits for me. Take what fits and leave the rest, and don't worry too much about us being on the same page about it.
You know, this is interesting because this conversation has been really helpful for me. In that semantic definition level, especially what John offered, that clicked something. And also, I'm doing this for kind of a different reason, because I'm also trying to figure out how to like regurgitate these words in my own way, because of what we do. And then related to that point, the point you're making about what people get out of religion and the kind of offense to deconstructing or doing away with religion, there's something in that actually relates to what Jordan Peterson does about religion, which is I think there's a bit of a fear about over-intellectualizing what people don't get an intellectual benefit from out of religion. It's almost like in investigating and understanding and deconstructing, it destroys, which I don't have the experience of with religion per se. I love the investigation. I love to go as deep as possible in that definitional, semantic, heady kind of way, because I'm connecting almost like a programming interface between a depth in myself and the head, right? So I like to have the definitions and then plug them in somehow, but not everyone does that. And I know that's for people who aren't heady, it's really not a delightful task at all. But I do think a lot of that has to do with this kind of unjustified fear of getting into specifics, as if it's impossible to connect the head and the heart, or the head and whatever. I hate using that term, but the head and a deeper kind of emotional connection to spirituality or religion. Does that make sense? Did I say that well? Okay.
Yeah, but I also think that that it's impossible to not, I mean, for everyone on the planet not to bring their own personal baggage. So there might be 5 religions that we're talking about, but there are 7 billion people who have a different kind of a relationship, a separate, private, personal relationship with all of them. And so I think it's pretty hard to make much generalization about it. I mean, I think there's so much personal stuff that comes into those, specifically in the religious sort of understanding, that I don't think it's probably important to even analyze it. It just kind of is what it is.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to actually circle back to something that I brought up really early on in this conversation, and it's that it's actually impossible to strip our perception all the way to whatever just is reality without our perspective on it. And so this relates to this conversation, because it's always about the relationship of the agent and the arena. So your perception of the world, your understanding of things, how you connect different concepts is in a way unique to you. And even if you have an awakening and you recognize that your sense of self is constructed internally and it's not really this like solid thing, it's kind of a, changing thing moment to moment, and different parts of the brain interacting with each other, whatever, that your experience of reality is still filtered through the sense of self, even if you realize that it's a construct. And it's not possible to totally strip that. So I think that because of that, we can never come up, and can never, maybe it's an extreme statement, but I don't think it would be possible to come up with kind of a perfect statement about these things, that it's always going to be somewhat relational, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and particularly, religion, and then I would say next would be sort of country, of origin maybe, but I would think particularly religion, and that's why I really very much like, I'm with you, David. I very much like John's sort of speaking style, his teaching style, whatever. I think he kind of hits for me a sweet spot, because he's explaining it, he's feeling it, and very much I very much connect with the way he presents it.
I'm definitely in the other camp. I don't hate watching him, but it's definitely hard.
I sense that, he has kind of a real affection for all of these different religions and all of these different points of view, and that really comes across when he teaches, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I feel like
it's somehow doesn't surprise me, Mike, that it's hard for you, and
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't recognize that fully, but hearing it, it's like, oh yeah, that actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so useful to have the notes and it was, school was definitely hard for me, so I had to already learn in my own way so I can deal with it, but it's definitely glucose intensive, that's for sure. It's not easy.
I feel like the just what Yuvi and John were both saying made me realize or wonder, I guess, this idea of the religion that's not religion, whether that's actually coming at it from a having mode standpoint of like, okay, we have to make a new religion that's not a religion, and then people follow it, versus what about changing the way that people pursued their own religion and what they look for in their own religion and how they practice their own religion, because all religions have these traditions within them, right, of mysticism and awakening and all of this stuff. It's very different, but it is there. Anyway, that just made me think, because I think it's, in some ways, it's a very losing proposition from the start to try and create a religion that's not a religion.
It's always corruptible.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of what's happening? I kind of think that, I mean, if you look at sort of game B and kind of all of the talking and thinking and discussing about what the future is, I mean, isn't that sort of what's happening?
It,
I
it seems
feel
like a
so.
group of very intelligent people trying to figure out how to motivate a group of people that won't bother to investigate, instead of trying to figure out how to but that's part of the problem as well. Like, how do you motivate people to want to investigate for themselves, like, or become more sovereign? Like, you can't just make people be sovereign. So, and I think people
So
do want some sort of kind of collective
Yeah, but making
networked
it,
meaning that they get from religion. It's almost like a top-down structure, or like almost like blue in integral theory. It's like they need that kind of dad tells me what to do sort of thing, and they don't want to have to investigate things for themselves. So I think that's what the attempt of creating a religion that isn't a religion is. I could be wrong.
I don't know, because there's also a social glue aspect to religion of community that I think is maybe something that I could be wrong, but I feel like that's maybe something that's missing and is key that is being aimed at is the wrong thing, but sort of
felt.
looked at with this religion that's not a religion. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
I haven't seen the episode, so I shouldn't comment anyway.
So there's an interesting aspect of this, which is I mean, just actually taking the phrase itself, a religion that's not a religion, is problematic because it's clearly you can't know what you mean by that. Create an apple that's not an apple. What do you mean by that? So what he means by religion on the creating part versus the not part depends on who you are. So when you said, Mike, just now, finding a way to motivate people who aren't already motivated, and think, no, that's not actually the point. It's actually finding people's innate motivation. And religion doesn't do that for some people. And science doesn't do that for some people. So it's finding the religion, finding what is sacred to you, and then finding a way to relate to other people who don't find what you find sacred, as if that relating is also sacred. If you can do both of those things in an agent arena way without needing them to see your way of seeing things, then I think that's the ecology of practices. And it actually has me notice that the ecology of practices won't be the same for each of the three types of people or every person.
Yeah.
Every person will need to find their unique ecology, and it'll depend on the way that they orient and their level of maturity. So it's a process, and I think that is an essence of what I think of when I think of religion that is not based on dogma, but religious that is based on the process. That's what I think of when I hear religion that's not a religion.
That sounds like the process for creating a collective intelligence, because you have different kinds of cells that are interacting with each other synergistically without necessarily knowing how the other cells operate. If you think about the cells in the body, does the liver cell know how the heart cell operates? Not necessarily, but they're able to communicate, and through networks of nerves and hormones or whatever, to create a coherent whole.
I mean, religion isn't, I mean, looking at the dictionary, the definition is multiple definitions, but a specific fundamental set of beliefs and practices generally agreed upon by a number of persons or sets. So to me, the word religion may be really loaded, but I hear it as more like this, not as something with fully developed like Christianity or other religions. I see it more as what you just said, which is sort of a collective consciousness, really. And it feels to me like that's what's going on.
From that perspective, I think it's an interesting idea. I wasn't so on board before, but yeah.
And it's also interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah. Also, I want to say that the way that John or I don't know, someone said it, it's like that there are 5 religions. That's quite incorrect. Actually, there are hundreds of different religions, like maybe thousands, and each has its own history, when it is founded, how it is founded, how it's developed through the ages. So it's like very, very complex. Like if you start studying, really studying religion, it's a very complex, like material in order to make sense of all of it. Um, and also another point that was coming out when David talked about is the process of individuation. At some point, even if the people are identified with religion, if some religious sect or group, very often there comes a time when the person starts individuating and creating his own personality, and at this point he starts disidentifying from some of the religious content and creating his own, like his own set of beliefs or his own set of world frame that he works with. So yeah.
I love what in the comments Gunter just shared, which is thinking of religio as the genotype and religion as the various phenotypes, the expressions of that genotype. There's something nice about that metaphorical frame, because religio is very a very different definitional orientation than religion as you read the definition, John. It's much more about the agent arena relationship. That's religio, right? And that is a unique personal thing that can't be a agreed upon set of beliefs, right? That's kind of the opposite in some way. And the distraction, the distinction between this is really kind of interesting. This is at the risk of turning it too heady again. There's something in this that has me circle back around to what Mike was talking about with attachment, which is, and this ties back to what you were saying, Yuvi, as well, about you can't really get down to the bare metal reality. In some way, we can't experience anything without a map. Recognizing that no map is actually a truly accurate reflection of the territory. And yet there's something about non-attachment, which if you take non-attachment, if you become attached to non-attachment, paradoxically, you get the belief that if no map is actually an authentic representation of the base reality, I should do away with all maps. And at that point, there really is no way. That is like sort of dysfunctional non-dualism or something. That's what I mean as the extreme version of non-attachment. And the recognition that, oh, if I'm attached to non-attachment, that's an attachment. So that's the paradox, and I can build up from there and notice, okay, so I can't get rid of all attachment, because that's a contradiction, right? This is kind of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So it's like, okay, cool. If I can't get rid of all attachment, then I don't even need to worry about, it's really a moment by moment. What's appropriate for me right now, with being mindful of where am I deceiving myself. I think that's really the heart of the ecology of practices. How does that fit for me in cultivating wisdom, so that I know what is Kairos right time for me and right action. Right? It's not about Buddha's Eightfold Path even isn't about, oh, I can define it for you. Here's the definition. Here's the thing. This is the way you should get to. There's not a teleological right place to get to. You're already there. Recognizing that is the process of enlightenment. Cultivating that wisdom is learning not to be confused by the sense that I'm in the wrong place.
This reminds me of the book The Brothers Karamazov, and that we are actually talking about the constant battlefield in the human heart, and that's attachment versus non-attachment, and that we are both insects and saints at the same time. But I think it's back to where we started. It's damn hard because and when we it's being attached to non-attachment, like you said now, because we raise children, we may be believing in a God, we have work to do, we have so-called careers, we have love and attachment and so on. So it's a it's a real, like I said, it's a battlefield and a real balance. And I for sure haven't found my way here, but reading the Brothers Karamazov helps. Especially when the father, who is really ridiculous father, he goes to the monastery and says to all the monks that you sit here and you hide away from the world and you eat cabbage. How do you think that saves the world? So yeah, just some reflections.
What he said is very interesting because there's this distinction between earlier Buddhisms and Theravada Buddhism and later Buddhisms, Mahayana, and I forgot the other. Never mind. But the distinction is that in earlier Buddhisms, the idea about Buddha was to really like go in the cave and go in nirvana and leave samsara, which it's a very basic, which in its very base is a dualistic worldview. And the later Buddhisms, actually, their proposition was, okay, go there, like experience nirvana, but then come back and bring it into the society, into the world, and help. They mocked it with help liberate all living beings, but yeah. So they identified the antisocial behavior of the earlier Buddhisms and actually tried to correct it with a more proper worldview in a way.
I almost say that there's even another layer on that, which I think we're coming to now, which something like the believing in kind of the compulsory bodhisattva-ness, that we're required to bring it back to the world. It's like,
yeah, I'm glad you said that, because there's no middle ground of like just come back and be. It's like, no, we have to have that propagator meme component to it. I was thinking it, but you said it.
Well, I guess if you're like interacting with people and not in a cave, you're probably like bringing it back either way.
I don't know how that's true.
I think that the distinction is bringing it back with a particular valence, or just bringing it back. There's something in the notion that there is a solved state, that if we can finally get to the point of perfecting perfectionism, then we'll be done. That feeling of doneness feels like it's I recognize that's a given drive, and a non-owned intentionality, right? Intentionality that I'm born with, that I could just look at and say, oh, that motor's going to never stop turning, but I can decide whether or not to attach to that motor or not. Right?
Yeah.
I agree. yeah, and it's like Ken Wilber said, it's like a couple of different wake up, grow up, and everything, and a couple of different vectors that you can expand in, and probably it doesn't have an end to each one of them. But you wouldn't know that if you were in a cave to begin with. Yeah.
It's also in the distinction between the process and the state. So trying to achieve some sort of perfect state is a losing game because, well, first of all, there isn't a static anything to
It
life.
just screams
and to
attachment,
evolution.
doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like life continues. You know, living beings are never in a flat state, even though we might look at something and see like, oh yeah, this table is stable. But if you look on a long enough time scale, this table, you know, is a tree, then becomes a table, then it deteriorates into dust, and etc. Same thing with humans. Like we are never in a solid state in a way. So it's the same with all of our processes, you know, and things that we're trying to achieve. It's like more of a direction and a process rather than a state.
This has been interesting.
The journey, not the destination.
I'd love to at some point, David, if you're willing, and everyone really to dive into that heady deconstruction area if you feel like it. Not this time, we probably got to go, but just to understand. I don't know. It's more of an exploration to me than anything. I don't know if
Yeah, I
anything
agree.
anything
I would-
comes out of it, but
I'd be interested in it as well, and you know, again, not to go into it now, but just the notion that what UB just said about its process more than product or endpoint,
Yeah.
that we can go second order on that as well. We can think, oh, I have the right process. There's a having mode to the process
Yeah.
as well, and it's like, oh, okay, this is never ending. I can create all sorts of, which in some way seems to be, I mean, in some way that seems to be kind of what reality is these nested layers of product and process.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that we can talk about it in those state kind of ways, but be referring to, you know, you can put so much of this into language, into programming. You can build algorithms that adapt and change, and you can say that algorithm is static because you wrote it, but it's self-changing as well. So it's interesting. You can talk about it in finite terms, but it is more than that. Like it's like I'm in search of some sort of self-changing algorithm. Not to rely on it, not to stop thinking, but out of curiosity are there any answers out there? Are there any right ways, or what happens if we all just go take this non-attachment to the end? What does that look like? Or what are the boundaries, you know? Especially that. Like I at least want to know where, you know, where I can define the variables in this self-correcting equation. You know what I mean? Like where are at least somewhat of the borders so that it fits in, even though I know the whole thing is not static.
It's actually interesting that you just one quick thing you bring up. What happens if we take non-attachment to its logical end? Oh, sorry, I have a screaming baby. I actually investigated that at one point, and the answer for me was the heat death of the universe.
Heat death of the universe.
Yeah, because if nothing can be attached to nothing, then there's no friction, no motion whatsoever, and it's just absolute zero.
We're having another semantic problem there, though. I mean, the whole non-attachment thing has to be glued in if we're going to have this conversation.
It's true, and another part of it, just to kind of put a flag in this for a future discussion. It is interesting to me that DNA seems to be that kind of a code, right? It's not the kind of code that has a deterministic outcome. It's not telling you exactly what to do. It's a kind of code that interprets the current circumstance and your current development, right? It incorporates a lot of that feedback loop at various scales, an agent-arena relationship. And it's like, that's pretty amazing. Our coding doesn't, our language and our ability to write code doesn't currently work like that. But I think that we may be heading in the direction of understanding code that way. That's fascinating, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really powerful possibility to move towards.
Yeah.
Didn't Vervaeke give you that answer though when he said that that the meaning and the event are fused, and sort of trying to pull them apart or trying to separating them so that the event isn't the meaning and the meaning isn't the event, and that happens when you die. So that's sort of the answer. When you die, they are no longer fused. So isn't the answer death?
And we also said it doesn't have to wait until you die. It certainly will happen when you die.
Right,
but you can't have.
Exactly,
but you can't have. So the other aspect of this is that each time it does happen before you die, it is in essence a kind of death.
Yeah.
Right. This is the reason I love Inside Out, is because when Riley goes through her reboot, that's a kind of death, and allowing that to happen, right, is that kind of break.
That's sort of the door that you're looking at to go through all the time. At any time you might be through that door, you're always going there, and that's non-attachment.
My intuition about it is that continuing that process relieves a whole lot of suffering, but it almost just compacts suffering into a smaller space of time, and like you concentrate it now so that it's not eating at you the rest of your life.
I would ask you, Michael, what is maybe to explore what does non-attachment, attachment and non-attachment, because they are different words, but what does non-attachment mean to you? Like, have a clear definition. Is it an experience to live moment by moment without being attached to anything? Or is it a way of interacting with people? Or
I can't add any more to it than what I did before, which is a desire for an outcome and a grasping onto things, wanting desire for something to be a certain way.
But this is attachment. What is non-attachment?
Absence of those things.
Absence of a desire.
A desire for an outcome, an absence of a desire to hold and grasp.
Okay, and that's like a mode of being for you?
Is it a mode of being?
I don't know.
No, is that your question?
It's your. Is that a mode of being?
It's something. It's a continuous project for me, I would say. Like it's something for a long time I've been working at, and I do meditations around that concept of what causes emotional disturbances through attachment in me, and then I work on separating them, and just not needing the outcome. I mean, I just work on the non-attachment aspect, and I can't say I'm done with it, but I've worked on pretty heavy stuff, and I don't even advocate it for people, but I do think if your life already really sucks and you're suffering a lot, it can be a pretty good solution. just to let go of the outcome. I mean, that's self-created suffering. That's so much suffering. When I look out in the world, that seems to be a big piece, you know, wanting the climate to not collapse, wanting, you know, species to not go extinct, and a lot of that stuff. Not saying that this is a solution. It's just that in a lot of cases, suffering prevents right action, you know? Attachment prevents right action. So seems like something worth working on.
It
It's-
seems like it would be probably a better conversation for another time because there's so much to deconstruct there.
Yeah, I love this conversation though. That this is I'm very passionate about this subject because it has been a long time project. So maybe sometime, maybe we can do it in the call.
But then one comforting thing that John said is that we have way more control over the meaning that we think, and way less control over the events than we think.
Remind me to bring up a DMT trip I had about my attachment to meaning.
Please share.
That's a throw your head in the dryer kind of story. That's the worst, one of the worst things I've ever done. All right, I think unless anyone wants to add more, I think now is probably a good place to wrap up.
At the risk of pushing my luck, the only thing that I'd add is that there's a notion that I've had in myself for a long time of the sense of an opposable self. And what I notice is, just in listening to this response is some attachment, like I need to actually say something else in order to tie the meanings together. But if I look at me and investigate, where in me do I actually feel and sense that need arising, is a level of attachment. There's something in the tension. Like I hear something and something in me feels compelled to name something about my experience, to relate to it in a particular way that has a discernible sense about it.
You're speaking in the first person, but are you referring to anyone else's experience or just exactly you?
I mean exactly me. I am curious if it applies to other people as well. I don't know that. At one point I thought, oh, this is universal. I'm now not so sure.
Right.
I wonder if this is a person who orients towards tactile learning, tactile mode of perceiving.
Can you restate the question?
When I hear something propositionally that causes me to feel like I need to respond, when I'm either feeling passionately agreeing or righteously defensive about something, the tension is in me. There's a place in me where I can find a dissonance between two parts of myself that are fighting each other. One of them vocal and one of them subvocal, one of them that I can't quite name. But if I actually relax the vocal part, if I relax the part that's doing the defending and ask it, can we actually listen to the part that we're trying to suppress? Something shifts. That's a way of playing with attachment, tightening or loosening a grip that allows a kind of movement and allows a deeper relating and a deeper experience of the present moment for me.
I understand and agree with what you're referring to as far as when I feel that emotion and disagree with it and want to speak up. I don't have a whole lot of vehement agreement. Doesn't have to have attachment in it. It can be an enjoyment. It can be like, yeah, I fucking love that. Like, to really be excited about it. But I don't feel that one has to have the attachment behind it. So I let myself have a pass on that a lot, where I just get excited and agree. And it's really just because something's clicking, right? Like I'm suddenly understanding that our sense-making models are coming into congruence with each other, and that's cool and exciting, and I like that. It's really fun. But the desire to defend absolutely is attachment.
It just occurs to me right now that this kind of relates to what John brought up at the very end of the difference between eros, philia, and agape. That eros, I fucking love that, is a consumptive kind of, it's the best cookie I've ever eaten. I want more of it, which is a kind of attachment.
Well, it doesn't presuppose the wanting more. Like, you know, I've often wondered, like, what is the experience of doing heroin like? You know, just to try it and then play with the most addictive substance and then put it down. Because I think there is a separation in loving something and then putting it down. And I don't think to love something with extreme intensity requires that you also be attached to it.
Well, and it's interesting because that's what he said, you know, the thing about love a cup, use it every day, become attached to it, and then smash it. Show that
I love that.
Yeah. Show that
I love that. I really need that. Yeah. I like that.
Because really the attachment is the sense of wanting the love to continue or wanting the suffering to stop, right? That's attachment to outcome again. So it's the underlying emotion doesn't matter. It's more the response to the emotion.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very aware of that because I do have an addictive personality, and I will get into playing video games and then just, 6 hours go by and I'm like, what the hell happened? Or it's the first thing I'll think of when I need to actually do work. So it's something I'm paying attention to. This loving of something in the moment, but let it go because it's such a biological urge,
I love that sense of that as well. And again, one of the things I think about in relating this to the master and his emissary, where it looks at the relationship between the two halves of the brain, is that in some sense, the left brain is definitely having mode. The right brain is definitely more towards being mode. The balance is learning how to allow both of those to exist. And yet, if you started with that sense of both of them allowing fully to coexist, they almost need to individuate in order to have any kind of perception at all. So I need to have some development of them individually in order for them to come together. And so I don't want to get to a point where they're always fused, and I don't want to get to the point where they're always separate. But that relationship, that cycle and vibration between them at various scales is the process that seems to be what the universe is wanting.
I'm curious if it's, rabbit hole, but I'm curious if it's, I'm rephrasing this as I think about it. I've had the desire to understand the connections of things, to become aware of how they work. And not always for the sake of gaining sovereignty within them, within my reaction to it, but just to understand and be willing, be conscious when I'm engaging in the behavior, right? To understand that I'm playing this game. Yes, this is not the right thing to do right now, because I find that's the best possible chance of sovereignty, to understand how the mechanism of it works. But it also, I don't know, maybe it's not the most effective way to do it. But my assumption is that understanding how things work will help you to interact better with it. I don't know if that's true though.
David, what was the name of the book that you mentioned it earlier? You're reading a book about two sides of the brain. What was the name of that?
The Master and His Emissary. It's by Ian McGilchrist. Really good book. It's a little bit heavy. It's a good book to read, but it's
Emotionally
neuroscience.
heavy?
No. Cognitively heavy. It's pretty deep into neuroscience, and it covers. It's a pretty long book. I'm a kind of a neuroscience geek.
I think you mentioned it a month or so ago also. I'm interested in looking into that.
Yeah, but it's a powerful one for me. I want to name one last thing, and then I'm going to be done. This is going to be my last comment. But just this weekend, talking to somebody, there was an interesting notion of, do I want to leave a legacy, or am I happy with knowing that I've made an impact in the world? Do I need to see what the impact is? Like, in some way, this question really arises for me. So like every decision, like, oh, I'm choosing to play video games. I know it's unhealthy. I'm choosing it anyway. That's a sovereign moment, even if I'm bullshitting myself. And that might cause some ripple effect down the path that is perfect. And the question is, do I actually need to see what the full feedback is? Do I need to know that in order to be satisfied? Or can I just trust that the universe is unfolding in the way that it is?
Well, you know what? That can be detrimental if you at all want to be goal oriented, that non-attachment thing, because that's basically what's happening is I'm detaching from some future event I want and doing this right now in the moment because it's fun right now. So, and I am goal oriented, so future me sometimes doesn't like it. Future me is not here right now, though.
Also, I wanted to comment that I think I'm not sure if I'm correctly understanding what you mean by to understand what is going on. I think it's more about being mindful, like having the presence in the present moment to be able to make sense of what this moment means, and noticing that a part of you wants something and another part of you is not okay that you're going to do something, and being able I think that is a skill that is developed very much by like basic concentration, like noting concentration, and also just developing the muscle of concentration. And and also the conflict between the two parts of you, the one that is addicted and the one that's not. It's maybe that's the field of psychology and integrating the shadow and doing that kind of work, like exploring why it's addicted, why that one is addicted, and why, So I don't know if you worked. I don't know if you worked in that style with these things, but just
This brings up an interesting point because, and it's actually a difference between how we've talked about learning, being more kinesthetic or whatever you want to call it. Like, I do find I deconstruct things intellectually first, but a lot of it is because I know a lot of my actions are driven from a kind of a logical standpoint, and I know that that's not always the right thing to do. And that if I don't understand intellectually what my body's reaction to something is, the behavior is not going to correct itself. So there's this kind of intellectual checking in with what's going on with the rest of me, the addiction, the that kind of stuff, or anything, so that I can put the monkey to bed. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to get the monkey on board with everything, because it's not always willing to do what if we use the elephant and the rider thing, it will fuck everything up that the elephant wants to do. And often for me, the elephant's doing the right thing. The elephant is just doing what it's evolved to do: eat, sleep, procreate, expand potentially future possibilities, at least a short distance into the future. Like, it's, to me, it's not always just about dopamine and sugar. It's like I feel like I have to convince the monkey to play ball with it. And so on that note, with the addiction stuff, I think I do understand it. It's not really a shadow material kind of thing. It's more of a dopamine thing. You know, video games is just the next best thing is injecting dopamine directly. Like,
when did you start playing video games?
oh, when I was a little kid.
Why did you? Why were you?
Because it's
playing video
shiny
games when
colors
you-
and it flashes. And then it makes a ping that makes you feel good.
Yeah, yeah. But there's also
So-
the social element to it. Yeah, and different people start playing well different reasons. But yeah, I
for
see
me-
what you mean.
Yeah, it hits a lot of the buttons for my personality as well, because I love graphics and I love technology and I love understanding how the stuff works, and you know, I love the psychology that goes into it, and I just love every element of it. It's so endlessly layered and interesting. And I even pull philosophy out of it. I mean, the amount of times I've brought up video games and the philosophical implications of it in my life and others in these calls, it's just, you know, many times. So, yeah, it's a lot of reasons to be addicted to it. You guys want to play with me?
Yeah, I feel that there's a lot of reasons to be to love it and to like it, but why the addiction? Like, addiction is a compulsive thing. Like, I understand why you love it and why you enjoy it very much, but what does the addiction have to do with it? Like, the addiction is not necessary, I think.
Yeah, it's really a matter of priority. I have goals in the world, so if I want an outcome in the future, I'm not going to be detached to everything. Then I have to put the controller down and go engage.
No, I mean, an addiction is a compulsion, and compulsion is something that's outside of your conscious control. So
Yeah, but
by that,
consciousness will come in and regain the controls, and that's what.
yeah.
So it's interesting. I've studied Gene Keys, which is an interesting book by Richard Rudd that has a contemplative aspect to it. My particular profile has addiction as one of the elements. One of the positions. Addiction has there's a gene key that has addiction as the shadow side. The siddhi or divine aspect of it is silence, and the gift or the thing that mediates between the shadow and the divine is invention. And the relationship of those three things is kind of an interesting thing. So there's something of transcending the addiction, which gets to silence, but it's that gap and the needing to fill the gap that is where invention comes from. And it's a beautiful recognition of the relationship between this.
That's perfect. That's it. It's like, I'm not building future thinkers if I'm doing this. I'm not inventing something. I'm not creating. And the path to that is stillness. Just shut up. Don't go into the office. Don't bother with this stuff. Just shut up, sit down, do nothing. And then invention inevitably follows. Yeah. It's interesting. Those three components. I never would have pieced that together, but it's so true.
Something that is coming up for me is like, I'm just reading this book, a very good book called Inner Work. And in there is a story. There's actually a practice called active imagination there. And there's a story about this woman who started painting her house. But then when she entered her, when she went to sleep, she couldn't sleep like at all, because her mind was just ruminating over what colors to use, what patterns, what materials, etc., etc. And she used active imagination. So she went in her imagination and she asked this compulsive thing, this compulsive person, why doesn't it leave her to sleep, basically. And her mind formed an image of a Japanese androgynous, like not man, not woman, but a Japanese person who was very interested into with art and with beauty and with colors and with creating something that was just about creating without having an outcome. And she realized after she wrote after this exercise, she wrote about it, and she realized that all her life she had suppressed a sub-person inside of her that when got a little bit of opportunity to create something beautiful, just overcame everything else, overcame the whole personality, and and after that, in her shadow work and work with the therapist, she actually made time in her life to fulfill the desires of this subpersonality, of this Japanese subperson, to paint and create pottery and all that kind of stuff. So it's not compulsive, but it's an integrated part of the whole of this person. So it really resonated with the idea of the distinction between having a compulsion for something and being able to I don't know, doing things without being compulsive, I guess, something like that. Yeah, just enjoying things without the compulsion connected to it. Yeah,
I think just allowing comes to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
soon I think. No.
Yes, just a quick one sentence. That is coming from a person that I was fucking addicted for a long time about a bunch of stuff. So video games, alcohol, and other stuff. So yeah, I know the feeling very well.
That doesn't surprise me in your comment to Mike about addiction is not necessary.
Patrick, were you going to say something?
No. Yes, I think we are running off soon. But I think one of the biggest things today was to approach an ontological identity, I think, more than the historical bullshit, ego-driven, blah, 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 blah identity. That was the big payoff for me today. And I think I will dream about that for many nights. That achieving wisdom and dying today is a good thing. So
interesting.
Yeah. So thank you very much, all of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. See some of you next week and some of you Thursday. Bye, guys. This was fun.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
This is fantastic. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you all.
I'll still
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.